let's talk about the different types of scientific questions. And we're going to start off with descriptive and exploratory questions. So what do I even mean when I talk about this type of scientific question? What I'm referring to is the underlying statistical question behind a particular medical research paper. This flowchart tells you about the 6 broad categories of statistical questions you might be asking when you're analyzing data. In this lecture, we're going to focus on descriptive and exploratory analyses, and in later lectures, we'll cover inferential, predictive, causal, and mechanistic. The first question you might ask in a medical paper is, did they collect data? And if they collected it, did they summarize it? If they did, then it's a data analysis, and you can use this flowchart to help figure out what kind of analysis they were doing. The next question you might ask is, did they report summaries of the data without any interpretation at all? If they did that, then it's a descriptive data analysis. So here's an example with cartoons that show you what a descriptive data analysis is. In this case, there's a population. There's 18 meeple. These are all the meeple in the entire world. And we can describe them by saying there are 10 green meeple, 2 green meeple in bow ties, 4 purple meeple, and 2 purple meeple in bow ties. We're not trying to say anything about the relationship between color and whether they wear a bow tie or not. We're not trying to infer anything about a broader population. We're just describing what we see. A concrete example of a descriptive data analysis is something like a census. In the United States, we run a census every 10 years. And what we do is we collect information on people's demographic and geographic background. We collect that information so we can describe what's going on in the United States. We're not trying to make a statistical correlation or infer something about a population. We're just trying to say, this is what the people in the United States can be described as. Often it's expensive to do a census. You have to collect data on every single person in the population. So what people usually do in medical studies is they take a sample. So for example, you might take a random sample of a few people that come into a clinic. In our cartoon example here, I've taken a random sample of 3 meeples. There's 2 green meeple and 1 purple meeple. So when you look at that, you can say there's a description of this sample that has just those 2 numbers, 2 green and 1 purple. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on in the population. It just says this is what we observed in the sample. But something to keep in mind is that when you take a random sample, you might get different answers and different descriptions in each different sample. So for example, if we took a second random sample, we would have 2 green meeple, 1 purple meeple, but now one of the green meeple is wearing a bow tie. So this is a little bit different than the first sample, and it's okay. We're just describing what we see in the sample. Here's an example from the literature. So this is a case report, and it's about a man with labile blood pressure. And in this study, all they did was collect data on one person and just described what they saw. So for this man, they show over time the blood pressure of this particular person measured on that particular day. So all they're trying to do is describe what they see and not necessarily make any inference about what other people will be like. Typically, case studies are this kind of descriptive analysis. The next type of analysis you might look at is an exploratory analysis. So in this case, they reported the data, but they did start to make some interpretation of that data. But they didn't start to quantify whether those relationships will hold in a larger population. They're just saying, we observed this relationship in the data. So the question you ask yourself is, did they quantify whether the discoveries are likely to hold in a new population or a new sample? And if the answer is no, then it's an exploratory analysis. So in this case, we've again taken a sample from our population of meeple, and we've observed that there are 2 green meeples, and they're both wearing bow ties, and 1 purple meeple, and they're not wearing a bow tie. So in our exploratory analysis, we would say, we observe that green people are mostly wearing bow ties and purple ones are not. Notice we're not saying anything about whether we believe this will hold true in the bigger population. We're just saying we saw this relationship in the data that we've sampled, and we think that it's interesting. So that's what an exploratory analysis is. It's not necessarily saying something broader than the sample that we've observed, but it's reporting a relationship and interpreting it. Here's an example from the literature of an exploratory analysis. Here we're looking at health system costs for individuals with non-communicable diseases. And so this is an analysis of publicly funded health events in New Zealand, but they're not necessarily saying anything about what would happen if we looked in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in China. They're just talking about New Zealand. So here's an example of a table from this data set. And what they're showing is the total number of people with non-communicable diseases and people without, and they're reporting their expenses broken down by inpatient, outpatient, or laboratory costs. And so what this is an exploration of the relationship between costs and the type of disease. Again, not necessarily inferring to a larger population, but just exploring what they see in a particular data set. So here we've covered descriptive and exploratory analysis. In the next lectures, we'll talk about what if you want to try to quantify those relationships and make them more concrete.